A little boy calls 911 for help. My mum locked me in the bathroom and did terrible things to me. What happened? The rain lashed against the windows of the police station, the relentless rhythm echoing in the near-empty room. Richard sat at his desk, methodically organizing the scattered papers in front of him. His neatly trimmed moustache twitched slightly as he glanced out at the stormy night. Across the room, Luke lounged in his chair, tossing a small rubber ball against the wall. The soft thud of the ball hitting the surface contrasted sharply with the howling wind outside. "This storm is relentless," Luke muttered, stretching lazily. "Think it'll let up before our shift ends?" Richard chuckled dryly, his voice steady, but carrying a hint of forewarning. "Storms like these always pause right before the real trouble begins. Consider it the calm before the bigger storm." Luke laughed, though it carried an edge of unease. "You're always so dramatic, Richard. Maybe it's just rain." The wind outside suddenly died down, leaving an eerie stillness. The absence of noise was so abrupt it felt unnatural. Both men paused, their gazes meeting in quiet acknowledgement of the shift. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder in the silence. Then, piercing through the tranquil moment, the telephone rang. Its sharp, jarring sound made Luke flinch, the ball slipping from his hand and rolling under the desk. Richard stood, his expression instantly serious, and reached for the receiver. "Police station. This is Officer Richard speaking," he said, his voice professional and calm. Luke straightened in his chair, his earlier nonchalance replaced by curiosity. At first, there was no response. Richard's brow furrowed as he listened closely, straining to catch even the faintest sound. Then it came, a shaky, hesitant breath on the other end. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "Hello? Who is this? Are you safe?" he asked, his tone softening but remaining firm. A small, trembling voice finally broke through. "My mum, she locked me in the bathroom again." Richard froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice was that of a child, frail and filled with a terror that was almost palpable. Luke leaned forward, his eyes wide with concern. "What's going on?" Luke whispered urgently. Richard held up a hand to silence him, his focus entirely on the child. "Stay calm," Richard said into the phone, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "Can you tell me your name?" "Where are you?" The child hesitated, a muffled sob escaping before answering. "It hurts. She does things that hurt me." Richard closed his eyes briefly, the weight of those words hitting him like a blow. He forced himself to remain composed. "Listen to me. I'm here to help you. I need you to tell me where you are so we can come get you. Can you do that for me?" Another silence followed, filled only with the sound of the child's shaky breathing. Richard's patience never wavered, though every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the child whispered, "I'm in the bathroom." Richard understood then that the boy was in danger. "I promise no one will know you called. I just need to know where you are to help you. Can you choose if I know? Please." But before he could respond, a noise interrupted the line. It sounded like a door closing in the distance, then a gasp, and then a deep silence. "Don't pick up the phone," Richard cried, his voice hoarse. "Don't be stupid. We're here to help you." But it's useless. The dry sound of the amplified receiver echoed in his ears like a sentence. Luke rushed over, his expression tight with worry. "What did they say? What's going on?" he asked, his voice edged with urgency. Richard, still gripping the phone, slowly placed it back on the cradle. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "It was a kid. Sounded terrified. He said his mum locks him up and hurts him. No name, no address. Just begged for help." Then hung up. Luke blinked, struggling to process the weight of those words. A kid? How are we supposed to find him? We've got nothing to go on. Richard's jaw tightened as he met his partner's gaze. I don't know yet, he admitted, his voice low but resolute. But we can't just sit here. That child called us because he believed we could help, and we will, whatever it takes. His determination was unmistakable, though Luke's eyes reflected a mix of fear and doubt. So, what now? Luke asked, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. Richard exhaled sharply, as if trying to steady himself under the crushing weight of responsibility. We start looking. We don't stop until we find him. The room grew silent, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the steady ticking of the clock amplifying the tension. Both men knew this night, which had started out so uneventful, was about to spiral into something far more than they had bargained for. And though neither spoke it aloud, the same haunting question lingered in the air. What kind of nightmare was that child living through? The station's quiet atmosphere had shifted dramatically, now charged with urgency. Richard still stood by the phone, his brow furrowed, a mix of worry and resolve etched into his features. He turned to Luke. We can't just sit here hoping he calls back. That kid needs us now. Luke gave a firm nod, already moving toward the computer. Okay, let's see what we've got. Can we trace the call? His fingers flew over the keyboard as the screen flickered to life. Richard sat beside him, his focus locked on the monitor. It wasn't a registered number, but we can use the emergency tools to get a rough location, he explained, his tone clipped but calm. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only lead they had. The system churned through the data, each passing second marked by the relentless ticking of the station clock. Both men watched the screen intently, their nerves taut as a bowstring. Luke drummed his fingers lightly on the desk, muttering under his breath, "Come on, come on." Finally the screen blinked, revealing a map with a small circled area, a rough estimate of where the call had originated. Richard leaned in, pointing at the highlighted section. Here, it's a small neighborhood. We start there. Luke raised an eyebrow, skepticism creeping into his voice. That's not much to go on. We could spend hours knocking on doors. We don't have hours, Richard shot back, his tone brooking no argument. That kid doesn't have hours. He's in danger right now. We move now, or we fail him. Luke sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew Richard was right. All right, he said finally, standing up and grabbing his jacket. But I'm grabbing coffee on the way. Something tells me this is going to be a long one. Both men gathered their gear in haste. Richard tossed the patrol car keys to Luke as they headed for the door. You drive, Richard said, already flipping through his mental notes. I'll figure out how we're going to approach each house. Luke caught the keys with a frown. And what exactly are we supposed to say? Hi, is anyone here locking a kid in the bathroom? His sarcasm barely masked his growing tension. Richard paused, his expression stern. No, but we'll look for signs. We'll listen. Pay attention. That boy called us for a reason, Luke. We can't let him down. The patrol car roared to life as they climbed in. Rain pelted the windshield as they pulled out of the station, the tires splashing through puddles. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil brewing within them, both men knowing that this was no ordinary call. As the car sped toward the neighborhood, Richard's mind raced with possibilities, while Luke focused on the road ahead. Somewhere out there, a child was waiting for them to keep their unspoken promise, to find him, to help him, to bring an end to his nightmare. And neither of them was willing to let the storm or their own fears stand in the way. The streets outside were cloaked in shadows, illuminated only by the faint yellow glow of streetlights. Richard stared through the rain-speckled windshield, his mind racing as fast as the patrol car speeding down the road. The urgency in the air was almost suffocating, a silent pressure building in his chest. "Richard." Luke broke the heavy silence, his voice low but tense. "Do you think we'll get there in time?" Richard exhaled sharply, closing his eyes for a brief second before answering. "I don't know, Luke," he admitted, gripping the wheel tighter. "But I do know this. Whatever it takes, we're not stopping until we find that kid." The car surged forward, its tires slicing through puddles on the pavement. Behind them, the soft wail of sirens from backup patrols echoed faintly. As they entered the residential neighborhood, the flashing red and blue lights painted streaks across the modest homes. Each house seemed to whisper stories of quiet family routines, children playing on swings, parents unwinding after long days. But tonight, that serene facade was broken by the officer's urgent search. Richard slowed the car in front of a simple house with a small, overgrown yard. "We'll start here," he said, stepping out with a purposeful stride. He knocked firmly on the wooden door, the sound echoing in the stillness. From inside, slow, deliberate footsteps approached, and a dim hallway light flicked on. Finally, an elderly man cracked the door open, his cautious eyes peering out. "Something wrong, officers?" the man asked, his voice a blend of curiosity and unease. "Good evening, sir," Richard began, his tone calm yet professional. "We're investigating an incident. Have you noticed anything unusual tonight? Any strange noises or disturbances?" The man frowned, shaking his head as he tightened his grip on the door. "No, can't say I have. It's always quiet around here." Richard nodded, handing the man a card with the station's number. "If you do hear or see anything out of the ordinary, please call us right away. Thank you for your time." As the door closed, Luke let out a frustrated sigh. One house down, and nothing. This isn't going to be easy. "Didn't expect it to be," Richard replied, his voice steady but firm. "We keep going." And so they did, moving door to door with unwavering determination. Each knock was met with sleepy-eyed neighbors, polite but unhelpful. A woman in a floral robe adjusted her glasses as she murmured, "No, officer, haven't heard a thing." Another man, cigarette in hand, shrugged and muttered, "Not much happens around here." The deeper they went, the heavier the weight of the unanswered questions grew. As they walked toward the next house, Richard glanced at Luke, his expression taut. "There's got to be something," he muttered. "Someone has to know. A sound, a movement, anything." Luke nodded, though his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "This place feels too quiet. It's the kind of quiet that hides something." They approached a house with a rusted swing set, creaking gently in the yard. This time, a young woman answered, her face pale and cautious. She held a toddler on her hip, his sleepy eyes peeking out from behind her shoulder. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice guarded. "Good evening, ma'am," Luke said, offering a reassuring smile. "We're checking the area regarding a report. Have you noticed anything strange tonight? Any unusual noises or disturbances?" The woman shook her head quickly, adjusting the child in her arms. "No, officer. We've been inside all night, just the kids and me. Is, something wrong?" "Nothing to worry about," Richard interjected gently. "If you hear or see anything, please let us know immediately." She nodded hesitantly, closing the door with a faint click. Luke sighed deeply, his frustration evident. "None of this adds up," he muttered as they walked back to the car. "If that kid called from here, someone must have noticed something. A voice, a sound. anything. Richard's jaw tightened as he slid into the driver's seat. Maybe they're scared to talk, he said grimly, or maybe they don't even realize what's happening under their own roof. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken worry. The calmness of the neighborhood, so picturesque and serene, now felt ominous, like a mask concealing something sinister. The officers sat in tense silence for a moment before Richard turned the ignition, the engine growling to life. The patrol car's lights flashed once again as they pulled away, ready to continue their search. Each unanswered knock only fueled their determination, though the clock was ticking relentlessly. Somewhere in this quiet suburban grid, they knew the child was waiting, frightened and alone. "Next house," Richard muttered, his eyes scanning the map. "We're close. I can feel it." Luke nodded, his resolve firm despite the weariness in his bones. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, the stillness pressing down on them. Every passing second stretched thin, the tension wrapping tighter around them. Yet they drove on, knocking on doors, waiting for the moment when someone, anyone, would finally have an answer. Each rejection from the neighbors felt like a heavier weight pressing down on their shoulders. With every no, the urgency intensified, a haunting reminder that the child who had called might be facing unspeakable terror at that very moment. Richard and Luke pressed on, moving quickly down the dimly lit street. Their eyes darted from house to house, scanning for any sign, any clue. Richard gestured toward an old house further ahead. "We can't let up now," he said firmly. "That kid is here. I know it. We just need to find the right door." Luke nodded, his frustration visible in his every move. "I know, Richard, but every door we knock on is just another dead end. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." "As long as it takes," Richard snapped back, his tone unwavering. "That child trusted us. We can't let him down. Do you hear me? We can't." They approached one of the last houses in the neighborhood, a dilapidated structure with shuttered windows and an overgrown yard. Everything about the place screamed neglect. As they reached the front steps, a sound cut through the stillness, a sharp, anguished cry. Richard froze, his hand instinctively rising to signal Luke to stop. Both men tilted their heads toward the house, straining to listen. At first it was faint, almost like a whisper, but then it grew clearer, a child sobbing, desperate and broken, followed by a terrified plea. "No, please, don't do it again." The words hit them like a blow, slicing through the night's eerie quiet. Luke's breath caught, and his voice was taut with urgency. "Did you hear that?" "Of course I heard it," Richard replied, his eyes fixed on the door as though he could see through it. "That's him. It has to be." Fueled by adrenaline, Luke took a step forward. "We can't wait. That kid is in danger right now." "Hold on," Richard said, placing a steadying hand on Luke's shoulder. "We have to be smart about this. We don't know what's happening inside." The two officers approached the door cautiously, though their hearts pounded loudly in their chests. Richard raised his fist and pounded on the door, his voice cutting through the night. "This is the police! Open the door, now!" The house remained silent, save for the muffled sobs emanating from within. Luke's jaw tightened, his gaze darting to Richard. "If they don't open up, we're going in. We can't let this go on." Richard nodded, stepping back to assess the situation. His voice rose again, firm and commanding. "This is your last warning. Open the door, or we'll come in by force." The child's cries grew louder, more desperate. Each second felt like an eternity. Richard met Luke's eyes, and with a resolute nod, he gave the order. "It's time." Luke didn't hesitate. Together, they braced against the door, their shoulders slamming into the wood. Each impact echoed through the quiet street, punctuated by the child's cries. The sound was unbearable, but it spurred them on. "Hang in there, kid," Richard muttered through gritted teeth as he threw his weight against the door. "We're here. We're getting you out." Finally, with a splintering crack, the door gave way, the sound reverberating through the silent neighborhood. Richard and Luke exchanged a quick, determined glance before stepping inside. The air inside the house was thick, heavy with tension, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. Their steps were careful, but purposeful, as they followed the cries deeper into the darkened interior. The sobbing served as their guide, drawing them closer to the child who had placed his fragile trust in them. Every movement carried the weight of what might lie ahead, the unspoken fear that whatever they found could change everything. Richard's voice cut through the darkness once more, sharp and commanding. "This is the police. If anyone's in here, make yourself known." The silence that followed was deafening, save for the child's quiet, hiccuping sobs. Luke's eyes darted around, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster. "Richard," he whispered, his voice tight with tension. "We need to move faster." Richard nodded. They couldn't afford another second of hesitation. The cries grew louder, closer, and the two officers pressed forward, their determination unwavering. Whatever awaited them beyond that final door, they knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't leave without the child. "Do you hear that?" Richard asked, his voice tense as he gestured toward the narrow staircase leading to the second floor. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of muffled cries pierced through the oppressive silence, accompanied by the steady rush of running water. "It's coming from up there," Luke said sharply, already moving toward the stairs. "Let's go." The two officers raced up the creaking steps, their boots thudding heavily on the worn wood. Each groan of the stairs under their weight seemed to amplify the tension in the air. When they reached the second-floor hallway, they hesitated briefly. Several doors lined the corridor, all shut tight. But from one at the far end, the sounds of sobbing and the distinct trickle of water drew them forward. "That's it," Richard said through gritted teeth, his jaw set as they approached the door. "Be ready," Luke replied, positioning himself beside Richard, his shoulders squared and his breathing steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Richard banged on the door, his voice booming with authority. "Police! Open the door now!" There was no answer, only the heart-wrenching cries of the child growing louder. Richard glanced at Luke, and in silent agreement took a step back before slamming his shoulder against the door. It shuddered under the impact, then burst open, revealing a scene that stole the breath from both men. The small bathroom was a dismal sight. Grime streaked the tiles and the stench of mildew hung thick in the air. Water poured from the faucet, spilling over the sink and pooling on the floor. Huddled in a corner was a boy, no older than 9, his thin arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His face was wet, not just from the water soaking the room, but from the tears streaming down his cheeks. Hey, it's okay," Richard said gently, stepping into the room with deliberate care. His voice was calm, though his eyes darted around, assessing the situation. Luke moved swiftly to check the rest of the room, ensuring there was no immediate threat. The boy's sobs grew louder as the officers approached, his wide eyes darting between them, filled with a heartbreaking mixture of terror and a fragile glimmer of hope. "You're safe now," Luke said softly, kneeling beside the boy. "Nobody is going to hurt you anymore. We're here to help." For a moment, time seemed to pause as Richard and Luke absorbed the gravity of the scene. They'd arrived in time, But the questions swirling in their minds promised answers far more troubling than they were prepared for. Richard's gaze shifted from the boy to the center of the room. In the faint, flickering light from a single exposed bulb, the source of the child's anguish became horrifyingly clear. Sitting in the rusted bathtub was the boy, his frail body trembling uncontrollably. His skin was blotched with angry red welts, some so severe they looked like they burned with their own agony. The boy's cries were sharp, cutting through the officers like a blade. His body flinched with every small ripple in the water, as though each drop against his skin brought fresh torment. Between his sobs he choked out fragmented words, barely audible, but their meaning was unmistakable, a desperate plea for help. Richard and Luke froze momentarily, overwhelmed by the sight, but quickly snapped back into action. Richard stepped forward, his voice commanding as he directed his attention to the figure by the tub. "Step away from the child now," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The woman beside the tub, presumably the boy's mother, startled at the sound of his voice. Her face was streaked with tears and sweat, her hands trembling as they hovered over the child. With steady hands, Richard gripped the woman by the arms and guided her to a corner of the cramped bathroom, away from the trembling child. Tears streamed down her face, her body shaking with each uncontrollable sob. "It's not what it looks like. Please, you have to believe me," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she raised her hands defensively, as though shielding herself from unseen accusations. Luke stood firm, his tone measured but unyielding. "Ma'am, you've got a lot of explaining to do," he said, narrowing his eyes. "This doesn't look right. Step away from the child. Now." She shook her head frantically, her voice a desperate, jumbled whisper. "You don't understand. I was only trying to help him. Please, just listen." Her voice escalated into a wail, the sound raw and strained, clawing for sympathy. Meanwhile, Richard, still holding the small boy in his arms, felt the child's tremors ripple through his own body. The boy's muffled cries, full of fear and pain, burrowed deep into Richard's chest. He locked eyes with Luke, his face etched with concern. "This isn't normal," Richard murmured, his voice heavy with unease. "There's something going on here that we don't fully grasp yet." Luke nodded slightly, but kept his focus on the sobbing woman, who clutched at the air as though the words she struggled to form could bridge the growing gap between her and the officers. The tension in the room was suffocating, the very air thickened by the weight of what had transpired. No one could say for certain what had unfolded, but it was clear that this moment, with its desperate cries and heavy silences, would leave a permanent mark on everyone involved. The woman's shoulders slumped as she lifted her tear-streaked face to meet Richard's steady gaze. Her exhaustion was palpable, but some deep instinct compelled her to speak, to defend herself against their judgment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, quivering under the strain of her emotions. "It's not what you think. Please, hear me out," she began, her eyes darting from Richard, who held the boy with cautious tenderness, to Luke, whose stoic expression carried just a flicker of compassion. Luke inclined his head slightly. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice even. "Help us understand, because what we just saw doesn't look good." She drew in a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she pressed them together. The words spilled out, chaotic and urgent, driven by desperation. "My son," she said, her voice faltering, "he has a severe skin condition, atopic dermatitis. His skin flares up, gets covered in rashes, and itches so badly that he scratches until he bleeds. I can't," her voice broke, "I can't let that happen." Luke folded his arms and took a step closer, his skepticism plain. "And that's why he was screaming like that? Ma'am, that boy was in pain. "You think that's okay?" "It's not okay. I know it's not okay," she cried, her voice rising as fresh tears streamed down her face. "But what else can I do? Warm water soothes his skin. It's the only thing that helps, even if it stings at first. If I don't, the rashes spread, and it gets worse." Richard, still holding the boy close, glanced down at him. The child's small body was limp against him, his breath hitching as he tried to calm down. Red, inflamed patches marred his skin, as if his body had been waging a relentless war against itself. Richard's heart clenched. Whatever the woman's methods, the boy's suffering was undeniable, and so was her anguish. "Why haven't you taken him to a hospital if it's this serious?" Richard asked, his voice low but firm. "This isn't something you should handle alone." Her head dropped, her hands flying to her face as though she could shield herself from the question. "I've taken him, of course I have," she said, her voice muffled by her hands. "But every time, the doctors tell me the same thing: expensive treatments, specialist visits. I can't afford any of it. I'm doing the best I can with what little I have. The warm baths are all that works, even if it hurts him at first." Luke exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples, his frustration mixed with confusion as he glanced at Richard. "You think this is enough? You think putting him through this every night is okay?" He was screaming. "Ma'am, it didn't sound like you were helping him. It sounded like you were hurting him." Her sobs grew louder, her voice breaking under the strain. "I know. Don't you think I know? Every scream, every tear breaks me apart, but if I don't do it, he suffers more. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to watch your child claw at himself until he bleeds, to see him burn with fever because his skin is infected." "I'm doing the best I can." Her words crumbled into a barely audible whisper, heavy with despair. Richard looked at Luke, his expression a mix of concern and resolve. "This isn't a simple case," he said quietly. "This doesn't feel like abuse, but something's not right here. We can't just walk away from this." Luke nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his tone remained guarded. For now, all they could do was stand in the storm of emotions that filled the small bathroom, piecing together the fragments of a story that was anything but ordinary. "What do we do now, Richard? We can't just leave things as they are and walk away like nothing happened." Luke's voice was tense, his gaze fixed on the sobbing woman leaning against the wall. Richard drew a deep breath, holding the boy closer to his chest as if shielding him from the world. "I don't know yet," he admitted, his tone heavy with responsibility. "But what's clear is this child needs help. We can't let this go on." The air in the cramped, dimly lit bathroom was thick with unspoken tension, as suffocating as the cries that had echoed through it just moments before. The mother, trembling and tear-streaked, leaned against the wall, her sobs softening to a defeated whimper. Both officers exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with uncertainty. Whatever story had unfolded here, it wasn't going to resolve easily. Richard, still cradling the boy, felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on his shoulders. He looked at Luke, who stood stiffly, his eyes scanning the mother's face as though trying to extract the truth from her expressions. "We'll take him to the hospital," Richard said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was steady but edged with concern. "The boy needs medical attention, and it'll give us a clearer picture of what's going on here." Luke nodded, though his face betrayed skepticism. "Ma'am," he addressed the mother, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you'll need to come with us. We have questions, and we need to understand what's happening." The woman, her face pale and wet with tears, nodded weakly. "Whatever you need," she whispered, her voice raw and broken. Just make sure my son's okay." Richard gently wrapped the boy in a blanket he found nearby, shielding him from the chill of the night. He whispered softly, "You're safe now, little one. We're taking you somewhere they can help." The boy, drained from his tears, barely moved, resting limply in Richard's arms. The drive to the hospital was silent except for the faint sound of the boy's sniffles. The mother sat in the back seat next to Richard, her head bowed, her trembling hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every so often she murmured something under her breath, prayers perhaps, her words inaudible over the hum of the patrol car's engine. Luke, gripping the steering wheel tightly, finally broke the silence. "I hope what you told us checks out," he said, his voice clipped, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked road ahead. "Because if it doesn't, ma'am, there will be consequences." The woman's reply came barely above a whisper. "It's true," she said, her head still lowered. "I'd do anything for my son." Anything. When they reached the hospital, a team of medical staff met them at the entrance. Richard quickly relayed the boy's condition, his tone clear and urgent. The boy was whisked away to the emergency room as a doctor motioned for the officers to follow. "What's going on with the child?" the doctor asked, his expression one of professional concern. "The mother claims he has severe atopic dermatitis," Richard explained. "She says the warm baths are part of his treatment, but we need to be certain. His condition worries us." After examining the boy, the medical team confirmed the mother's story. One of the doctors, a man with kind yet serious eyes, addressed Richard and Luke. "Severe atopic dermatitis can be excruciating for children," he said. "The inflammation and itching are unbearable and can lead to bleeding and infection if left untreated. The therapeutic baths, while painful, are crucial to managing symptoms and preventing complications." Luke, standing beside Richard, exhaled deeply. "But does it really have to hurt him this much?" The doctor nodded solemnly. "I know it seems harsh, but it's necessary. Without these treatments, his condition could worsen significantly and even become life-threatening." Richard glanced at the mother, who stood off to the side, clutching her hands to her chest. Her face was a picture of relief and sorrow, the confirmation of her story offering some solace, yet failing to erase the weight of her child's suffering. As the team prepared to admit the boy for further care, Richard approached the mother. "We're going to stay involved," he said firmly. "This isn't the end of it. You'll need to answer our questions and we'll ensure your son gets the help he needs." She nodded, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just thank you." In that moment, as the storm outside raged on, the real storm, the one of broken trust, unanswered questions and fragile hope, loomed even larger. While the boy was being stabilized and cared for by the medical team, Richard and Luke lingered in the hospital, ensuring everything was under control. Despite her apparent honesty, they knew their investigation was far from over. Yet, at that moment, the child's well-being took precedence over everything else. Standing by quietly, the officers listened intently as the doctor explained the boy's condition. Each word seemed to chip away at the tension they had carried since the case began. Relief began to settle in, but it was bittersweet, mingled with a profound sense of shock. They had initially believed the boy's suffering stemmed from abuse at the hands of his mother, but now the truth unfolded. A desperate mother had been doing her best in an impossibly difficult situation. Luke broke the heavy silence first. Folding his arms across his chest, he glanced at the doctor. "So, this was necessary," he said, his voice softer than usual, as though trying to grapple with his growing guilt. "All that pain, those screams, it wasn't because she wanted to hurt him. The doctor gave a solemn nod, his expression sympathetic but firm. That's correct. For someone so young, this experience is terrifying. He doesn't understand why he has to endure such pain, but without this care, his condition would be far worse. The mother is doing what she can with what little she has. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting toward the hallway where the mother sat hunched over on a worn plastic chair, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders still quivered with quiet sobs, but there was a flicker of calm in her posture now, as if the doctor's presence had restored a sliver of hope. "We need to talk to the boy," Richard said at last, turning to Luke. "He has to understand why this is happening. We can't let him think his mother is intentionally hurting him." Luke nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Richard's shoulder. "Let's do it. Maybe we can ease some of the fear he's been carrying all this time." The two officers made their way to the hospital room, where the child lay curled beneath a blanket, his small frame almost swallowed by the bed. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated his tear-streaked face. Though his eyes were still red and puffy, there was a tentative calm in the way he glanced around the room, the sterile environment seemingly offering him a sense of safety. "Hey there, champ," Richard said warmly, pulling a chair closer to the bed and sitting down. His smile was soft, inviting trust. "How are you feeling now?" The boy looked at him uncertainly, biting his lower lip as if afraid to answer. Finally, in a voice so faint it was almost a whisper, he murmured, It still hurts." Richard's expression softened further, his voice gentle but steady. "I know it does, and I'm so sorry. But there's something really important I want you to understand." The boy's wide eyes locked onto Richard's, searching for answers, for reassurance. Richard continued, his words carefully chosen, each one carrying the weight of empathy and truth. "Your mum loves you more than anything in this world. Everything she's done, everything has been to help you get better. It's hard to see that right now, but she's fighting for you because she cares so much." Luke stepped forward, his voice equally gentle. "You're not alone in this, kiddo. We're here to make sure you and your mum get the help you both need. And I promise, things will get better." The boy's lip quivered, but there was a flicker of something new in his expression, hope. For the first time since the officers had met him, the child's eyes seemed to carry the faintest glimmer of understanding. Richard reached out, giving the boy's small hand a comforting squeeze. "You're brave. You know that? Braver than most people I've met. And we're going to make sure you get through this." The child nodded hesitantly, his grip tightening around Richard's hand. For now, that was enough. Richard and Luke exchanged a glance, a silent promise passing between them. Their work was far from over, but they had taken the first step toward healing a broken family, and that in itself was a victory. Your mum never meant to hurt you. Everything she does, even when it stings a little, is her way of helping you feel better. The boy's eyes widened, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face. "So, she's not mad at me?" he asked, his voice trembling with the fear that still clung to him. "No, buddy. She's not mad at you," Luke said gently, crouching down next to the bed to meet the boy's gaze. "She's trying her best to make sure you're okay. Sometimes the things that help us can feel a little uncomfortable, but that doesn't make them bad." The child blinked, fresh tears sliding down his cheeks, though this time they didn't carry the same weight of fear or pain. "Really?" he whispered, looking up at the officers with a cautious glimmer of hope in his tear-filled eyes. "Really?" Richard affirmed, placing his hand over the boy's small, quivering one. "Every bath she gives you, every moment she takes to care for you, it's all because she loves you more than anything. more than you can even imagine. For a moment, the boy was silent, the officer's words sinking in. Slowly, his expression shifted. The heaviness that had weighed on his young features began to lift, and while his tears still glistened, the hint of a smile broke through. It was a small smile, tentative, but filled with something new: gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, glancing first at Richard, then at Luke, "for telling me that." "You're welcome, kiddo," Luke replied, ruffling the boy's hair lightly. "You're a tough little guy. Now get some rest, okay?" As the officers stood and moved toward the door, Richard glanced at Luke and murmured, "It wasn't what we were expecting tonight, but at least now he knows the truth. And that changes everything." Luke nodded, his eyes lingering on the boy one last time before quietly closing the door behind them. "Yeah, Richard. Sometimes all a kid needs is to know they're not alone." That night, the mother and son returned home, accompanied by the officers, who made sure everything was safe and secure. While the boy still felt a twinge of fear when it came to bath time, he understood now that they were for his own good. And he would always remember the night when two strangers in uniform showed up, offering a little light in the midst of his confusion and pain. And that's where their story takes a turn. A night that could have been filled with fear became one of hope and understanding, thanks to two compassionate officers. It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness and connection can light the way. What do you think about this heartwarming moment? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more touching tales like this. And as always, take care of each other, because sometimes just letting someone know they're not alone can make all the difference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.